Hi there and welcome to the channel, and it feels amazing to be back after a few months away. Apologies, but in November and December I was simply too busy with my job and with work to focus on the channel. But now, as we enter 2025, I have more free time, and so here I am, ready to resume. And I thought I'd begin with a November-December wrap to round off last year's reading. So without further ado, here we go. And we begin with three versions of the same play, Phaedra. Now, if you're not familiar with the story of Phaedra, she is the wife of Theseus, and while he is away, she falls in love with her stepson, Hippolytus, and she declares this love, and he rejects her. And then when Theseus returns, she accuses him to his father of having tried to rape her or molest her, etc. It varies by version. However, the reaction of Theseus is the same in each case. He's absolutely furious, and he calls upon the gods to punish his son, and they do this in gory fashion, and that is the bones of the story. So firstly, I read the original by Euripides. This is very well developed, and I imagine it does work well on the stage. However, it was topped by the second version by Seneca, the Roman writer, and this was really so powerful. The climax was just magnificent. It really did move me like none of the other versions. It wouldn't really work well on the stage, but as a piece of rhetoric, this was excellent. So the one I recommend is this. And then the third, and perhaps the best plotted, but the least convincing in terms of the ending, was this one by Racine, the French neoclassical dramatist. Yes, very well plotted, but it actually attempts to tack on a kind of happy ending, which I really did not find to my taste. So three versions of Phaedra. And next, more drama, and it is Henrik Ibsen, the Norwegian dramatist, and his The Wild Duck is the one I read here. I will in time get round to the others, and I do have some more collections of Ibsen's plays, but this is the first one I've read, and this was absolutely superb, highly recommended. I'll definitely be getting round to more of those. And then some Shakespeare. So this is the 6th and 7th Shakespeare plays I've read in the last few months, and this was A Midsummer Night's Dream, and it is beautiful as a play in its construction. It's possibly the best of the 7 or so I've read so far. Yes, oh dear, pure magic from start to finish. I'm not sure if I rank it more highly than Cymbeline. Cymbeline really is difficult to top in my affections. However, if you haven't read this, then please think about doing so. The next Shakespeare play was one of the comedies, and I haven't really enjoyed the comedies that much so far. I've read The Comedy of Errors, which is based on a play by Plautus, and I've also read this one, The Taming of the Shrew, which may also be based on a prior play, and it's very politically incorrect. I guess the equivalent of Petruchio, who runs this school for taming shrews, turning fierce independent women into complacent wives, would be someone like Andrew Tate. It really is something terribly toxic, and it's the kind of thing that today belongs in what they call the manosphere. So I didn't really enjoy it that much. Okay, Taming of the Shrew. And then moving away from drama, my interest in kind of the Roman period, I've been reading St. Augustine of Hippo with his City of God. Absolutely huge book, and it is very forbidding from the outside, but once one begins reading it, it's beautifully written. He's an incredible rhetorician, and his mind, wow, you would not want to get on the wrong side of St. Augustine, because his skills at constructing arguments and trapping you on the horns of a dilemma are absolutely unrivaled. And I've read so far the first 100 pages of this. I think it's books 1 and 2, and they go through the early history of the Roman Republic and also the period of the 7 kings that preceded it. And it uses lots of lines from the Aeneid and the Iliad too at times, and from Livy. So if you've already read Virgil, who I have here, and you've already read Livy's The Early History of Rome, then you'll really get a lot out of the first 100 pages of City of God. But then you kind of have to stop and make sure you've read on far enough in Roman history, so that the references Augustine is making you can follow. And I haven't done that yet. So I read 100 pages of that, and then I returned to Livy. And today, in fact, I read book 3, The Patricians at Bay, an 80-page or so section, and it was totally gripping. Featured in here is Cincinnatus with his famous 15-day dictatorship, where he helped end a military crisis that was affecting Rome, and then simply returned to his 3-acre farm, having done so, a model of humility. And you also have the death of Virginia, which echoes the rape of Lucretia. She's not actually raped, but Appius, who is the head of this Decemvir, this board of 10, has his eyes on her and basically tries to kidnap her. And her father, who's serving in the military, returns and basically does his best to defend his daughter. But when Appius comes out with a horrendous judgment that she's to be taken into custody of Claudius, his associate, then the father says no, better that she just dies. And so he grabs a butcher's knife, which is nearby, and kills his daughter, points his fingers covered in blood at Appius and says, this blood is on your hands, actually. And that triggers a sequence of events that, very much like the downfall of Tarquin the Proud, leads to the Decemvir being chased away from Rome, and Appius commits suicide, and so does another member of the board of 10. So that is all in here. So this Livy, I can't recommend it enough. It's not history written in an epic mode. You don't feel like there's a huge grand narrative here of the kind you find in Virgil, actually. But for me, that just makes it better. You can really follow the twists and turns of the politics here. Yeah, highly recommended. And on the subject of Virgil, yes, in the last few weeks, as I read City of God, I read more of the books of this. I've actually finished the first 7 books. And what that does, in effect, is take you through the first half. And the first half, as many commentators have noted on this book, resembles the Odyssey of Homer. So it's full of adventures. There are the Furies, there are lots of omens, all kinds of storms, encounters with the Cyclops. So at times it deliberately echoes Odysseus's adventures. You even find people who have been left over on islands by Odysseus, and then Aeneas encounters them. Yeah, excellent. And so I've now reached the turning point, and the second half of this resembles the Iliad. So it's all about this battle between Aeneas and Turnus. That is what we're going to be focused on for the second half. This is the Dryden translation, which is still regarded by many scholars as the finest of this in English. So there's no harm in reading this. It was written in the 17th century. If you've never considered reading the Aeneid, I urge you to do so. Then next we have another Roman writer. It's Marcus Aurelius with his Meditations, which is the cornerstone of Stoic philosophy. So you do see in the manosphere, that's twice I've said that on this video, isn't it? But I'd only heard that term relatively recently, and I really like it, the manosphere. He's a kind of go-to thinker for men who believe that they can live pretty much without any support from anyone else, who've adopted this kind of warrior mentality. And so this is the book they rely on. And it pretty much repeats the same basic lesson on every page, which is what's done is done. And you just have to move on with your life and not dwell on anything outside in the external world, and use your inner resources to maintain your equilibrium. There were some nice passages. I think I've bookmarked 3 out of about 130 pages, but I did get a little bit tired of it before the end. Okay, so beautiful picture on the front there. All right, next, some world classics. What is it? It's one of these very old Norton anthology of world masterpieces. Yeah, absolutely. So it's in pretty rough condition. But what did I read in here? It's got a very good introduction, actually. These are well worth picking up. Just go into a used bookstore and find very, very old editions of Norton that no current student would be using, and just pick them up for pennies, and you find all the same great material in there. So I just want to tell you what I read. Oh yes, it was a biblical story. The story of Joseph. that is what I read in here. And I did that because of a reference to it in Augustine. And I found, much to my surprise, that there was an episode in there that resembled the story of Phaedra. And that is the story of Potiphar's wife, who has no name in the Bible, but I believe in the Quranic texts she's identified as Zuleika. And she tries to tempt Joseph while her husband is away. And he, like Hippolytus, rejects her advances, and she rends some of his garments or something like this and presents them to her husband on his return and says, look what Joseph did. He tried to ravish me. The husband is suitably apoplectic and points at Joseph and says, okay, off to jail with you. And then Joseph spends some time in jail, and he gets out by interpreting the dreams of some of the jailers. And so then he winds his way back into the affection of the pharaohs. And what I discovered is the Phaedra story is seen as having an antecedent in the story of Potiphar's wife, which in itself descends from another story. I think it's an Egyptian story, the story of two brothers. So that was all terribly interesting. And then next we move to some just regular fiction. So in my downtime from all that heavy reading, I read some weird stories. So here is Algernon Blackwood with his Ancient Sorceries and Other Weird Stories. And the one I read in here was very, very good. It was a little like an M.R. James antiquarian ghost story, but without so much learning packed into it. I'm just trying to find the title. This book contains his two most celebrated stories, which are The Willows, which is pretty long, and The Wendigo, which is also quite long. They're about 50 pages each. But the one I read was called Smith, an episode in a lodging house. Not a very promising title, in truth, but it was narrated by some old man at the fireside to an audience on a cold winter's night, and it was very, very frightening indeed. Okay, so that was excellent. It also has a great cover there of a big cat. And following up on weird stories, I also have a Lovecraft collection, which I can't find. I'll find that in a moment. Oh, here it is. It's this Dagon and Other Stories, a Lovecraft omnibus with a truly appalling cover there. Just awful artwork. Let me just look inside and tell you about the ones I've read so far. Dagon itself, the first story, is not very good in truth. Then The Tomb, that was excellent. Polaris, so. Beyond the Wall of Sleep, yes, that one was actually quite good as well. The White Ship, not very good. Arthur Jermyn, so. And were there any others that were very good? The Temple, no, not that good either. And The Tree, so it's really been not many hits so far, let's just put it that way. Not as good as the longer stories, these shorter pieces. Perhaps the reason for that is self-explanatory. Kind of gave up on them because they were just not going in the direction he intended. However, it did help fill some of my downtime this month. Now, this is a completely different proposition. It's 4 romantic tales, German 19th century Gothic stories, and there is one masterpiece in here. Let me just read you the title. Sometimes translated in different ways, but it is, The Mad Invalid of Fort Ratonneau by Achim von Arnim. Yeah, sometimes translated as The Mad Veteran. You have to get hold of this story. It's in the tradition of Kleist's Michael Kohlhaas. It all starts, well, actually, where does it all start? It may all begin, in fact, with a battlefield injury, with a fragment of bone entering the skull of this invalid, but it ends with him holding the entire city. I can't remember the name of the French city offhand at the moment, essentially hostage because he's taken control of an arsenal and he's launching all kinds of rockets and bombs at everyone in the vicinity. And this is just a magnificent effort. The other ones, Blonde Eckbert by Ludwig Tieck, that was actually very good as well. And the final one is by the most celebrated of these teller of ghost stories. It is E.T.A. Hoffman with his My Cousin's Corner Window. For anyone engaged in literary studies, that may also be of interest because it kind of goes into the actual construction process of the story itself. So this rather unpromising piece of artwork on this book here actually contained 3 tremendous stories. I haven't read the other one, The Story of Honest Caspar and Fair Annie by Clemens Brentano. Who knows? Maybe all four are superb, but I strongly recommend getting hold of this. It's available for pennies online. Sadly, not much seems to have been translated by Akin von Arnim, and my German is non-existent, so that's the only disappointment here. And then something completely different. It is a French writer, Alphonse Daudet, with Letters from My Windmill and a beautiful Van Gogh landscape on the front, and it pretty much does what it says on the tin, as we say in England, and it has very gentle stories of the French countryside. They're just so tender. I found this really a very delightful read. It just takes you to a completely different place, and this was very successful upon its publication. Moving on, another short novel by Thomas Mann, one of my favorite writers, and much as he did in The Holy Sinner, he takes a very ancient story. This one is even older than the medieval narrative that he uses for The Holy Sinner. This is an Indian story from perhaps, 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. And I went back and read the original story, and it's incredibly brief, only 3 or 4 pages, but Mann manages to explode it into a 120-page or so novella, and it's very, very good. And it simply is about 2 friends whose heads get transposed with alarming consequences. And the ending was absolutely terrific of this as well. Such a great writer. So if you've read Mann, but you've never heard of this particular title, you may be intrigued by picking that up, and you can read it in an afternoon. Then finally, some books I use for my studies. So they're about beekeeping. If there is a beekeeping faction to the audience of this channel, then please get in touch with me and recommend some more books about honeybees, not about actually keeping them, because I live in an apartment. I've got no intention of starting up my own beekeeping enterprise, but simply the science of honeybees and the history of apiculture I'm very interested in. So we have here For the Love of Bees, and on the front is Brother Adam, who was a monk at a Benedictine monastery in England, where I happen to have worked upon occasion. I didn't meet him at the time. I think he would have died a few years before, but it's Buckfast Abbey in the southwest of England, which is where he bred the famous Buckfast bee. And so here we have a book all about his life story and his beekeeping exploits. There we have a big bee on the back. And another beekeeping story is this one, The Tears of Rur, by this guy, Gene Kritsky, who's written quite a lot about bees and beekeeping. I have another book of his, The Quest for the Perfect Hive, which is not as interesting as this one, which goes into all of the Egyptian history of beekeeping. This book is quite expensive, but I got it from the library. Very interesting read. And finally, back to the Roman literature, and it is this Folio Society edition of Petronius's, what used to be called the Satyricon, but it's now being called the Satirica. Okay, and it's translated. I'll have to give you the name of the it's in a slipcase. I have to give you the name of the translator because it's an amazing translation. If you're at all into William S. Burroughs, then you'll really want to read this, because Burroughs was inspired by Petronius and The Unfortunate Traveller by Thomas Nash, by the picaresque tradition right at its source. And this translation is by Frederick Raphael, and it has illustrations by Neil Packer, and it's a very beautifully presented book, and it has lots of colour plates, but I have to choose them very carefully because the Satyricon, if you're not aware, is a pornographic work, and I really do like Fellini's movie adaptation of it with the famous Minotaur sequence with the Balinese music. Yeah, that is a wonderful movie. And let me try and find one of the colour plates which is not offensive. Oh yes, this is about the least offensive, okay, but it does feature some pigs suckling on a mother pig, rather echoing kind of Romulus and Remus being raised by a she-wolf. But this gives you an idea of the production values. And so, as I said, what Raphael has basically done is use the kind of slang that you find in beat writing as part of this translation. So you've got this mix of the ancient source material with all kinds of American slang. You think it might not work, but actually it does work really well. So this is like reading a beat version of ancient literature, right? So that is, oh, I've got one more here. Oh, it features the Trojan horse. That really brings things full circle. So let me show you that. All right, Neil Packer is the artist concerned. This is a really beautiful edition. I hope to get some more of these Folio Society works. I've seen a few more in the used bookstore I frequent. So next time. So there we have it. I hope you enjoyed my return. Once again, I'll apologise for my absence, but I hope to be here on a more regular basis going forward into 2025. I wish you all a happy new year and that all your reading endeavours may be fruitful. But for now, all that remains is for me to bid you farewell in time-honoured fashion. So, until the next time, be safe, be strong, nanu nanu.